Cordelia was quoted as saying, "I admit, I have led a happy life, and I have lived for the pleasure of the world, letting none, absolutely none, of its pleasures pass me by. I would stop at nothing to gratify my desires." Cordelia saw herself as a grande dame, but she was described as a little woman, 5 feet, of stocky build, with a ridiculously short waist, a very full bust, a stiff, thick waist, distressingly solid below the bulb. The description is very full and not flattering at all, but nonetheless she had a way with men. Welcome, everyone, to the late 1800s and the mystery of the Bonbon murders. We'll start with John P. Dunning, the man Cordelia loved. John Dunning married the lovely Miss Pennington, the daughter of a U.S. congressman. Dunning wasn't particularly good-looking, and his occupation of a newsman for the Associated Press wasn't particularly impressive. John and Elizabeth were married in 1891 and had a daughter within the year. The marriage was successful for 4 years, and then Dunning was promoted to chief of the Associated Press Bureau in San Francisco. The couple moved to the West Coast, and that's where the trouble began. Soon, Dunning took up with other women. He drank, gambled, and lost money. Short on money to gamble, he stole money from his office, so he soon lost his job. In 1897, Mrs. Dunning decided to return to Dover, Delaware, to her father's home. She hoped her husband would come to his senses and get a job on the East Coast. So John Dunning is alone in San Francisco, having a fine time without his wife. One summer day in 1897, Dunning met his future. He was cycling in the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco when his bike wheel broke down. Sitting on a bench nearby was a fascinating woman. She was flirtatious and began a conversation with him. She said her name was Cordelia Botkin and that she was 29 years old, when she was actually 41. She told him she was a widow, but in reality, she was still married. The two hit it off, and after a while, he moved in with her at 927 Geary Street in San Francisco. At that time, Cordelia was living with her 25-year-old son, Beverly, and his mistress, Mrs. Seeley. Let's get some history on Cordelia. Cordelia was born Cordelia Brown. She was the 4th daughter of Colonel Richards Brown and his wife. She was one of 7 daughters and 1 son. Her father had a very distinguished military career and was highly respected in business. She came from a good family. So what went wrong? She met and married Mr. Welcome Botkin. Yes, Welcome is his first name. He was described as a large man of genial personality. He was also successful in business and afforded Cordelia with many luxuries. They had 1 son together. A few years later, Cordelia moved to San Francisco, leaving Welcome in Stockton. Cordelia and her husband lived apart because of diverse temperaments and tastes, but he has always provided for her. She stated that her husband frequently visited her at her apartments in the city, and she went to Stockton at least once every 2 months to enjoy the company of her son and his father. She said a divorce was never mentioned but once, and that was around 1896. A Mrs. Seeley came to her and said that her husband was preparing to secure a divorce so that he might marry a Mrs. Arbogast. Cordelia immediately went to Stockton and asked her husband if the story was true. She informed Welcome that she would never allow him to divorce her and marry Mrs. Arbogast because she had given him her youth and reared his son to manhood. Mr. Botkin said he had no intention of divorcing and marrying again. Mr. Botkin told her the information she received was false. So for many years the arrangement was that Mr. Botkin would come to San Francisco and visit his mistress, who was a woman other than Cordelia, of course, and continually, financially, support Cordelia in the fashion in which she was accustomed. Now back to Dunning and Cordelia. Dunning partook in Cordelia's bohemian lifestyle of alcohol, sex, and gambling. Although Dunning's wife had gone back to Delaware and he was cohabitating with Cordelia, he began to have many affairs with other women around San Francisco. Cordelia became jealous, but seemed to center her jealousy on his wife, Elizabeth, even though she was 3,000 miles away. Dunning would speak of his wife in a tender way, and that got Cordelia to worrying. Cordelia sent Elizabeth an anonymous letter claiming that her husband was having an affair with a pretty English woman, a lady by birth and educated. The note was signed, "A Friend." Elizabeth gave the letter to her father for safekeeping. Cordelia's jealousy grew when Dunning was sent to Cuba on an assignment. On August 9th, 1898, in Dover, Delaware, 3,000 miles away from San Francisco, Elizabeth Dunning was having dinner with her father, mother, and other members of her family. After dinner, the family moved out to the front porch. The group consisted of her father, mother, sister, Ida Jean, her husband, and a small daughter, Elizabeth, and of course her 4-year-old daughter, Mary, and several neighbors. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elizabeth's teenage nephew, Henry, who had brought a smallish package from the Dover post office addressed to his aunt, Elizabeth Dunning. Elizabeth was surprised. It was wrapped in a plain brown paper with no return address. She could barely make out the postmark of San Francisco. She opened the box and gasped with delight. A box of candy with 2 kinds of chocolate, soft and hard, and a handkerchief with a brief message, "With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C." The gift was a complete surprise. Elizabeth said she didn't know anyone in California with the initial C, but nonetheless, there it was, a wonderful gift. The candy box contained some 5 varieties of chocolate candy. The box might be purchased in any store for 50 cents. The upper portion of the tin box was covered with a cream white paper. Across the face of the box is embossed the words Bonbons in copper-colored gilt letters. It contained chocolate wafers, spiced chocolate, chocolate buttons, and creams with and without walnuts. Mrs. Dunning took some of the candy and handed it around to others. Her sister ate several pieces. Their father declined. Her mother, Mrs. Pennington, tasted some of the candy, but didn't like it and didn't swallow it. Several youngsters had some of the candy. Mrs. Dunning and her sister put away several large pieces of the soft candy. Later that night, everyone who chewed any chocolate candy became ill, but none as bad as Mrs. Dunning and her sister, Mrs. Ida Dean. They ate more candy than anyone else. The next day, the 2 sisters were still very ill. The family summoned the doctor. At first, he thought it was some kind of food poisoning, but why were the 2 sisters in worse condition than the others? Mrs. Dean's condition became serious. She died late in the afternoon of August 11th, and Mrs. Dunning lingered another day. All Kent was shocked and mystified. What caused the 2 deaths? Attention kept returning to the candy. This article showed up August 15th in a local paper in Dover, Delaware. The saddest day in Dover's history. Funerals of the daughters of ex-Congressman Pennington, murdered. This was their funeral. Services, which were held this afternoon at the Presbyterian Church, were attended by hundreds of people, and in fact the whole town showed signs of mourning for the unfortunate women. And the greatest sympathy was manifested for the bereaved family of ex-Congressman Pennington, father of the deceased women. There were many floral offerings, including a box of cut flowers from employees of the Associated Press, with which J.P. Dunning, husband of Mrs. Dunning, is connected. Her father knew of problems his daughter had been having with her husband in San Francisco. He also had a good inkling that another woman in California was involved, but he didn't know her name. He suspected the candy, so he sent the box to Dr. Theodore Wolfe, state chemist at Delaware College, to test the chocolate. The test results are explained at the trial. Cordelia became a suspect because of her relationship with Dunning. Detectives were determined to find evidence against her. They seized papers and letters from Cordelia to compare specimens of handwriting, and they hoped to find the identity of the woman who purchased the candy in Stockton. Detective McVeigh traveled the 3,000 miles from Delaware to bring evidence and continue the investigation of Mrs. Botkin. Elizabeth Dunning had been harassed for many months before her death by anonymous communications. She kept them all, and they may contain references that will assist in revealing the identity of the writer. Cordelia was accused of Elizabeth Dunning's murder, and now she was fighting for her life. There was a fight to see which state it was legal to hold the trial, Delaware or California. There was a technicality because Cordelia was not in Delaware on the date of the murder, and she never fled the state of Delaware. So all the technicalities aside, they held the trial in San Francisco. Men came 3,000 miles from Delaware to investigate Cordelia. Her husband, Welcome, defended her most loyally and emphatically asserted that he was satisfied of her innocence of the crime and that she has not been guilty of any wrongdoing. During the trial, the testimony of Mrs. Ralph was damning to Cordelia. She knew Cordelia for 7 or 8 years, and they had corresponded during that time. She said that the letters written to Dunning's wife and the note on the poison box of chocolates was Cordelia's handwriting. She also recognized the handkerchief as identical to one she had seen Cordelia use. They also talked about arsenic. A handwriting expert at the trial testified that the handwriting on the notes and letters was that of one person, and that would be Cordelia. Dunning and Cordelia exchanged letters beginning in April of 1898. He was on his way to Cuba at the time as the war was breaking out. They corresponded until July. It was brought out at the trial that Dunning had sent Cordelia a letter stating that he intended to go back to his wife after the Spanish-American War. That is also motive for the jealous, vindictive Cordelia to commit the crime. Dunning also testified that the handwriting on the note was indeed Cordelia's. The candy counter clerk, although she could not describe Cordelia's face except for it being round, she could describe her walk and her countenance, and she could also describe the candy box and the paper. The clerk at the Owl drugstore recognized Cordelia as the woman who bought arsenic from him. She also signed the register with her true name. And a Mrs. Harris testified that she sold Cordelia the handkerchief. The lab results on the bonbons proved Dunning's wife and his sister were indeed killed by arsenic poisoning, and that it was in the form of powdered arsenic. The doctor who examined 3 pieces of the chocolate found the powder in them, and 1 piece had a lump of arsenic the size of a pea. His tests proved that crystallized arsenic could not have been used as the defense has suggested, attempting to protect Cordelia, who had acquired powdered arsenic. The prosecution had several damning witnesses, but Cordelia denied all the allegations and continued to claim she was innocent. At one point, she said that she had been grossly and maliciously misrepresented by newspapers, and she was innocent of the horrible, cruel murders. The sensational trial was covered by papers all over the country. In the end, Cordelia was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. A month later, Welcome Botkin filed for divorce from Cordelia. You may think that's the end of the story, but Cordelia, being the minx she was, caused trouble in the prison. In July 1899, this article appeared in the Daily Republican, entitled "Siren of the County Jail." Another murder may yet be laid at the door of Mrs. Cordelia Botkin. The news reached Williamton, Delaware, from San Francisco last night in a letter from an official of that city who says that Cordelia has become the siren of the Branch County Jail, where she is detained pending an appeal on a life sentence. It stated that she has become fond of Frank McFarland, one of the guards at the jail. It has been an open secret that he was infatuated with Mrs. Botkin and had succumbed to her charms. His infatuation for her may result in he himself occupying a murderer's cell. He quarreled over her with another guard on Sunday night, June 25th. The quarrel led him to committing a murderous assault on the other guard. The injured guard, Kirschbaum, was on the verge of death, and McFarland was being held at the city prison, where at any moment he could be charged with murder. The two guards had argued over McFarland's marked attentions and scandalous behavior with Cordelia for many weeks. McFarland sought to give Cordelia certain privileges that are not allowed to other prisoners. Cordelia was always complaining and dissatisfied with everything, and found a faithful companion in her new lover, McFarland. Between the two of them, they caused the then superintendent of the jail to resign. The new superintendent was an easygoing fellow and did not interfere with the illicit relations of the murderess and the guard for forbidden privileges. Guard Kirschbaum, however, tried to do his duty and was beat with a blackjack. One of the matrons said that after McFarland committed the murderous assault, he left his victim lying unconscious and went upstairs to his own quarters whistling bits of ragtime music. This matron was also pressured to keep her mouth shut. Not quite 2 years later, in 1901, Judge Cook, who had served on her trial, was surprised to see Cordelia stepping off a cable car. He followed her down the street and around the corner to the women's jail annex, where she was welcomed inside. The judge investigated and learned that Cordelia was allowed 2 days of freedom each week in exchange for sexual favors lavished on the jail's wardens. Her cell was appointed like a brothel boudoir, with an oversized bed, velvet and lace drapes, and sexy mood lighting. There was a huge hearing about what the judge saw. The opposition actually brought in a Cordelia look-alike to try to confuse the judge, but he stuck to his guns. The judge put the kibosh on her sweet arrangement, and Cordelia was sent to San Quentin prison. But wait, that's not all. In 1904, she was tried again. She was determined to prove her innocence. The trial was another courtroom drama, but Cordelia was again found guilty. In 1904, Welcome Botkin died of heart disease at age 66. Beverly Botkin, Cordelia's son, died in 1905 at age of 32. He was known as a hard drinker and had an unsavory reputation. Still in San Quentin, Cordelia died at the age of 56 on March 7th, 1910. The state said the cause of death was because of softening of the brain due to melancholy. She never confessed to any crime. Do you think she poisoned the two women? Or do you think she was innocent of the heinous crime? Here's a mugshot for you. I bet you'll think twice before eating a bonbon sent to you by an unknown person. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more stories. Bye.